The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Real quick, I do have a correction about this clearly completely fraudulent Donald Trump medical letter. Let me just put that letter up for you real quick. All of our critiques from yesterday are valid, except for it does appear that Dr. Harold Bornstein is part of the gastroenterology department at Lenox Hill Hospital. The image we first looked at was a list of the department's leadership, not the full doctors. So I correct this with peace and love. All of the other critiques remain, but that one thing I do want to correct on the record. Okay, Donald Trump's desperation has escalated by orders of magnitude, probably in the last 15 minutes, but generally speaking over the last couple of weeks. And yesterday at a rally in Jackson, Mississippi, the Republican presidential nominee called Hillary Clinton a bigot, saying she would do nothing for African Americans and Hispanics. We have the video. Let's take a look.
Hillary Clinton is a bigot who sees people of color only as votes, not as human beings worthy of a better future. She's going to do nothing for African Americans. She's going to do nothing for the Hispanics.
The Hispanics.
She's only going to take care of herself, her husband, her consultants, her donors. These are the people she cares about.
Right. So the amazing thing is Trump is known for going wildly off script. Dana Bash from CNN said that the reference to Hillary's bigotry was actually on the teleprompter, although reportedly the teleprompter said Hillary Clinton's bigoted policies, not she is a bigot. I actually think, Rachel, that Trump should be worried about admitting to his supporters that Hillary Clinton won't do anything for blacks or Hispanics, because if they believe it, that might appeal to them and they might say, hey, I'm going to vote for Hillary. She's not going to do anything for blacks and Hispanics. It's dangerous in that way.
Right. That'd be a great tactic for him. But no matter what he's saying, he is still the bigot because he has 8% of the black vote.
Yeah, he's not convinced voters that actually Hillary Clinton is the bigot because he's actually polling 0% among black voters in some states and nationally, somewhere between 6 and 8%. For people who were watching today, some of the people on stage behind Trump were shocked, confused, and some actually entertained when Donald Trump called Hillary Clinton a bigot. Let's start first with this one woman who her first reaction is sort of looking like shock. We'll get back to her. Here's another person who reacted by laughing hysterically. The guy with the huge pin. I don't know what kind of pin that is, but as we know, the bigger the pin on your suit, the more patriotic you are. Next person who had an interesting reaction is this guy in the white beard he threw his head back in laughter when Trump called Hillary Clinton a bigot. The next picture I have for you is going back to that first woman whose look has gone from sort of surprise to absolute horror. And then I think we have one more here, which is this woman behind Trump who is just cringing. That is sort of I would describe that as a grimace, wouldn't you, Lewis?
Yeah, but it also could be a laugh, and both are acceptable when Donald Trump says something like that.
Breitbart News CEO Steve Bannon is now co-campaign manager for Donald Trump, so I don't think it's any surprise that he's going to this. And the crazy thing is the right claims to take really seriously accusations of racism and bigotry. They always say, oh, liberals are just so loose by calling everybody racist, calling everybody a bigot. And that seems to be exactly what Trump is doing, isn't it?
I mean, what else do they have to lose, right?
That's become the mantra of the Trump campaign now, I feel like. What does he have to lose at this point? He's turning everything around on Hillary Clinton. Apparently tonight at a speech, Trump is going to accuse Hillary Clinton of wearing a bad toupee, having an unnatural orange suntan, and also having really small hands. I mean, why stop at calling her a bigot, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's... I guess this is the logical next step in Trump's attacks. I mean, the normal stuff, the Benghazi stuff, the health stuff.
Too conventional.
Yes, you got to kick it up a notch now.
Let's talk about Bill Nye the Science Guy. CNN brought on Bill Nye the Science Guy yesterday to talk about the horrific flooding that we've been seeing in Louisiana, even in more inland areas of Louisiana, as I told you, that don't typically flood, that don't require home insurance. If you own a home in those areas, at least 13 people have died, 60,000 or more homes have been damaged. And we've been making this a story about climate change, because that's really what we're talking about. And it's important to distinguish between individual weather events and broader climate change. But as I've said it before, I probably feel like a broken record at this point. When we see climate change, we are going to see more erratic weather events. The weather events themselves are not the climate change, but it will be a sort of symptom and consequence of climate change. Bill Nye, you could tell during this 5-minute interview, there was something he wanted to say, and he was sort of holding back. And then at the end, during this interview with Chris Cuomo, he drops it, and it's accusing CNN of having a climate-denying meteorologist on the air. Let's take a look at the video.
Breaking. You would not need to have a military on the other side of the world protecting oil fields. People would not be as motivated to set oil fields on fire if we had renewable electricity here.
A big issue that we
in the
see
first world or the
we
West.
see hanging it over lots of parts of life. Let's see what happens coming out of this.
You know,
But
here at CNN, you have essentially a climate change denier meteorologist, and knock yourselves out. But this is a big problem, and it's not going to
it
go
is
away.
a bigger conversation for another day. Bill Nye, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep, not something we're going to talk about today. So Bill Nye didn't mention any names, but it's pretty clear he's referring to CNN meteorologist Chad Myers, who does have a track record of making comments about climate change. He once said that it's just very arrogant to think that humans could actually do anything on the planet to impact the climate, et cetera, et cetera. Whenever I hear that, whoa, that's a different conversation for a different day, I always think those will be that will be the death knell of the human race. Hey, you know what? That's a conversation for a different day.
Like those facts and those figures and all that reality of every day. Yeah, that's another conversation for another day. Clearly.
Now, in Chad Myers' defense, he went on Twitter and he actually made 2 tweets about this. The first one, which I will put up for you here, Chad Myers said, "Not me, moved to climate change in 2009, and then actually following that up again with another tweet where he said, what did he say? This one is not it. But anyway, he added, "A scientist can be swayed by data," and I was. So I have sort of mixed feelings about this, Rachel. On the one hand, some people are saying Bill Nye is hugely courageous. He went on CNN and he said to them, "You are part of the problem. You have this climate change denier on the air." At the same time, you could make the argument that Bill Nye showed up uninformed, not realizing that Chad Myers no longer supported those climate change denial ideas of 2009 or 2010. Hero, courageous, ignorant, uninformed, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because there was an interview. So he was prompted in this interview, but he did say that he wished that climate deniers, there would be a law to punish them. So,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right.
In another interview.
Exactly, in another interview. So would that be a violation of free speech then?
Yeah, some people are writing to me and they're like, you know, the optics are that Bill Nye showed up and he did a really great thing. But if you actually consider that Chad Myers has changed his view on this, and number 2, that once Bill Nye called for punishment for climate deniers, and what is that? I mean, that when we talk about violations of free speech and sort of thought police, when I hear a punishment for climate deniers, I understand punishment or taxation for companies that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere. I sort of get that legislatively. I never got clarification on what Bill Nye meant, Lewis, about a punishment for climate deniers.
Yeah, legal punishment, perhaps not. Should we persecute them? Absolutely. And while he may have gone a little overboard here or been a bit misinformed, he's using his celebrity and his influence to help fight this false equivalency issue that corporate media has when it comes to climate change, and that's massively important.
If nothing else, Jason, can we praise Bill Nye because by doing this, he was at least taking a risk that CNN would blacklist him and that he wouldn't be allowed back on, and to a certain degree, is there some courage in that?
I'd say certainly. I mean, to actually stand up for the truth, and it's so easy just to go with the big dollar money, propaganda that's out there and ride that wave. But back to the other point, I mean, I think what he's looking for is like a Game of Thrones-esque shaming where everyone has to be walked down the streets and everyone yells shame at them. Maybe that will get them to actually realize that, this actually is reality. I don't know.
Not a fine for what you say, but publicly ostracizing people. I'm so sick of this "that's a different conversation" thing that we sometimes hear on corporate media, because the conversation basically was, hey, what's happening with these storms and floods? Will there be more? What can we do? And then the expert says, well, what we need to look at is global climate change, and CNN is arguably part of that problem with this meteorologist. Oh, that's a bigger issue for another day. Now it's kind of actually the issue we're talking about today, isn't it?
Right. I kind of just feel like that's a cop-out to not have to address a larger narrative that's going on.
President Obama has been blamed for just about everything, even things that happened 5 years before he was president of the United States, like when Trump spokesperson Katrina Pearson blamed Obama for the death of an army captain in 2004. You might remember President Obama became president in January of 2009. President Obama has also been blamed for the response to Hurricane Katrina, which also happened when George W. Bush was president. A 2013 poll actually found that almost 1/3 of Republicans blamed President Obama for the bad response to Hurricane Katrina, which of course had nothing to do with him. He was not president at the time. He's been blamed for Ebola. Some aid workers and nurses actually blamed Ebola on President Obama. The war in Ukraine was blamed on President Obama. It's a very long list now. And now a Republican named Amy Holmes is actually blaming Donald Trump on President Obama. Let's see if we can figure out what case she's making here.
And Amy, the argument that I'm making, the political argument that I'm making is that that's great for the base. That will put 20,000 people into an arena all fired up. But it doesn't win general elections because there's just not the cross appeal that's necessary. How am I wrong?
I would agree with you that no, you can't win the presidency with your base, and that applies to the left as well. That applies to Hillary Clinton. But I disagree with your premise that this is coming out of right-wing radio. My former boss, Glenn Beck, has been on radio lambasting Donald Trump for the last year. This is ridiculous. If you want to point a finger at who gave us Donald Trump, you can point it to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and that is Barack Obama. That came from the midterm election in 2010 that gave you the Tea Party, the midterm election in 2014, where you had voters who said to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, we want to put the brakes on legislating by executive action, by President Obama taking this agenda to the left. And Donald Trump supporters, if you've looked at polling data over the last year, they actually sort of span the ideological spectrum. They're not just from the right, they're also from the center, also disaffected voters who want a voice in politics, and they feel that Beltway politicians have not been listening to them for a very long time.
What? I think the argument is the midterms saw the rise of the Tea Party. The Tea Party was against Obama using executive action. Trump supporters include people from the Tea Party who don't like the use of executive action. So thus Obama gave us Trump. I mean, is that the story that Amy Holmes is telling us here?
I think so, but it's interesting because the question also comes up, is this an attack on Obama's identity, or would she have applied this logic to, let's say, Hillary Clinton if she had been the president?
Oh, of course it's an attack on Obama's identity. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the whole executive action thing, we've talked before, Louis, about how President Obama has actually used fewer executive actions than certainly all Republican presidents, and even fewer than some recent Democratic presidents. This is, of course, what she's really saying. And this is interesting because I'm not exactly sure what identity boxes Amy Holmes checks, but shouldn't really matter. We're going to analyze what she said based on the words, not on her skin color. Of course, this is about President Obama as an individual who is half black and is accused of being Muslim by some and whatever. That's the anti-sentiment which has been coalesced by Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, what she did was this is kind of complicated, but let me go through this.
Please.
So Republicans over the past 8 years have blamed Obama for everything. They've
Right.
been crafting this narrative that Obama is to blame for XYZ, race issues, fiscal issues, poverty, you name it, because they don't like Obama, they don't want him in office, and they wanted him out 4 years ago. And now what she's doing is basically taking everything they said, claiming it's true and saying that this is the reason that we have Donald Trump, when in reality we have Donald Trump because of the rhetoric that those Republicans have been using for years that's anti-Obama and anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim.
It goes beyond that. Yeah, I mean, the Republican Party has coddled and incubated this horrifying, authoritarian, nativist, xenophobic, homophobic electorate, while trying to sort of publicly pretend that they're all about a big tent and inclusion and whatever. So, of course, now Trump shows up and he's way up front about the fact that he'll build the wall and Mexicans are rapists and Muslims are going to be banned. And the fact that the Republican Party has sort of quietly, sometimes not so quietly actually, allowed those ideas to exist, Trump puts them all together. The only people to blame are the Republicans who have allowed this to be a legitimate part of their party for the last 20 years, isn't it?
Yes, but she's also not the first person who's tried to blame Obama for Trump. The former Republican Louisiana governor Bobby Jindal said in the
it's funny already. Yeah, just his name, just mentioning him is funny already.
It is. In the Wall Street Journal, he said, okay, Obama created Trump because he refused to work with Republicans on healthcare reform.
You know, I remember it going a slightly different way, Jason. I thought it was Republicans who were doing everything possible to avoid any change to health insurance in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing anything they can to change, not to change anything and to keep, all this money funneling into the pockets they want it funneled into. And they're definitely going to use the same rhetoric. Once Hillary's elected, they're going to use the same rhetoric for the next 8 years to, excuse, Trump losing and not getting their way like a bunch of crybabies.
This is the second time Jason has used language that shows it, for him it's a foregone conclusion that Hillary Clinton, the whole when Hillary Clinton is president thing. I like how confident you are, but I'm not convinced yet.
I mean, I'm an optimist, but there still are, 70 days left for everyone to try to campaign and win. So,
all right, we'll take a break. Back with more after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Christopher Kane. Thanks so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is viewer-supported media, and you can sign up on the all-new David Pakman Show website at davidpakman.com/membership. And remember, stop at davidpakman.com/Amazon before doing any Amazon shopping whatsoever to support our show with the shopping that you probably already plan to do. I have such a great documentary recommendation today, and I had forgotten because Lewis recommended this to me so long ago, and I finally got to it because my Netflix queue is overflowing. It's called The Two Escobars, and it was actually produced by the Symbolist brothers, whose dad works with my mom at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. There you go. And it deals with two Colombian Escobars. The more well-known is Pablo Escobar, one of the, arguably, the most successful and richest drug kingpin in history. If you look at the dollar value of the drugs that he was trafficking, absolutely stunning. And another Colombian Escobar, Andres Escobar, a soccer player. And I remember this. I was 10 years old at the time of the 1994 World Cup. And I remember Andres Escobar scoring an own goal, scoring a goal against his own team. And not that long after, he was killed in Colombia. And I remember this vividly when I was 10 or 11 years old. The documentary, Lewis, which I know you've seen, is so well produced, and it is absolutely both horrifying and incredibly compelling.
Yeah, it's the best 30 for 30 I've seen. I wasn't originally a 30 for 30.
Right.
But it's a fascinating look into that country at the time, into the whole Escobar cartel thing, into soccer, and
also into the connection between Pablo Escobar and his funding of soccer.
Yes. Oh, yeah. The funding of soccer in general is a major theme in this, and he had a hand in it. Believe me.
Incredibly well produced. It is called The Two Escobars. It's on Amazon. It's on Netflix, and you can stream it directly from davidpakman.com/recommendations, where you can also see my full list of film and book recommendations. We've been talking about what's going on in Texas. The Texas Republican legislature has cut funding to reproductive health clinics, and Republicans like to brag about small government and fiscal conservatism. but their decisions really do kill people. I'm not being hyperbolic. We have now learned that the maternal mortality rate has doubled over a 2-year period in Texas. The rate of Texas women who died from complications related to pregnancy has doubled from 2010 to 2014. Texas now has the highest maternal death rate, not only of any American state, which probably wouldn't surprise most of the people in this room and many of the people in our audience, but of anywhere in what is called the developed world. The findings come from a report that appears in the upcoming issue of the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology that the maternal mortality rate increased so drastically, while most of the world, most of the developed world anyway, has reduced the maternal mortality rate. Excluding California, where the maternal mortality rate declined, and Texas, where it went up, basically the maternal death rate per 100,000 births rose a little bit in some parts of the U.S. and went up nearly 30% within Texas. This is absolutely insane. When we think about developed medicine and access to healthcare, we have this sort of idea, Rachel, that it's one way in the United States. And the reality is that depending on what state you're in, depending on how many family planning clinics have been closed by Republicans in your state, it's not actually that great of a place to have children as a mother.
Right. Well, besides the fact of taking a step backwards, nationally, if you look at the statistics, these deaths are actually in older women who are having these pregnancies, whether that's because they're entering into the workforce or whatever myriad of reasons. So what's interesting then is that in Texas, these women are getting pregnant, I think, around 18 to 25. So that kind of makes it even more shocking. You have these teen births, but then you also have the high numbers for people who are getting pregnant a lot later in life. Yeah,
in other words, when you look at what age are maternal deaths more common, typically it's older women on the grand scheme of things. However, it's mostly in the bluer coastal states where women, for reasons of career and culture, are delaying childbirth until later. So you would imagine that those are the states where maternal mortality would be higher because you have more older women having children. No, it's actually in the states that have more teen and young pregnancy problems, where, at least in the case of Texas, we're seeing it. Those, Jason, should actually be women who have a lower maternal mortality rate because they are younger.
I mean, this sounds like a conversation for another day, and what else do they have to lose? Oh, wait, they're children. This is a very, very serious issue, and, there's just too many facts and figures here to ignore it, really.
And that's actually, Louis, what we always hear, right? Oh, you want to reduce abortion? Well, the way to reduce abortion is reduce the number of pregnancies, give realistic sex education, fund family planning clinics, give access to contraception, etc. And when you tell the Republicans who claim that they want to reduce abortion that, they say, that's a different conversation. No, it's the conversation.
It's the conversation. It's a conversation they're not going to have.
No.
Texas is the epicenter of the strict father morality mentality.
Yeah.
And of course you have the religious side of it too. They're very connected. It's just a very backwards place. And most of these politicians don't even really care about this stuff themselves. I mean, it's all about keeping the status quo, getting reelected, staying in power, and
raising money,
pleasing your constituents and killing them at the same time.
What's most disturbing to me about this also, Rachel, is that so many, we know, number one, that even an organization like Planned Parenthood, 97% or more of what it does has nothing to do with abortion. That's number one. Actually, that other 97% goes a long way to preventing the pregnancies that ultimately lead to abortions, because one of the prerequisites for having an abortion is being pregnant. If you're not pregnant, you're not going to have an abortion. They actually shut down some clinics, Rachel, where some of those individual clinics did not even do abortions. Those clinics would have held down the number of pregnancies and ultimately the number of mothers dying in childbirth.
Right, because it's about health. Because back to the statistic that I was talking about before, for the older women who are getting pregnant, they need to be checked for hypertension and diabetes and chronic illness. And without these systems in place, how is this going to affect the numbers?
Yeah, it's complete bizarro world nonsense, and we've been following it, and we'll continue to follow it. I have a disturbing story from France, which unfortunately has become a frequent source of news about anti-Semitism. A Jewish rabbi has been stabbed in France. allegedly by a Muslim man screaming Allahu Akbar. The 62-year-old victim was reportedly attacked outside of a brasserie in the Jewish quarter in the northeast of Strasbourg. The attacker, who is understood to have been arrested, shouted the Islamic phrase meaning God is great during the attack, according to a number of different reports in French media. The attacker was apparently restrained by someone just walking by until cops showed up to arrest him. The unnamed spokesman said that the victim was wearing, quote, clear external signs of his religion and was not seriously injured, which is good news. Police are saying this is not terrorism, but a mentally ill perpetrator with a history of mental illness. Apparently also known to police, had a record, although it was not clear at the last time I looked what exactly that record was for. Whenever we have this conversation, Louis, about mental illness and terrorism, I always am going back to it's not one or the other necessarily. There's probably an overlap if we imagine sort of a Venn diagram. And by the way, there's a whole host of crimes where you're probably mentally unstable to some degree. And I feel like sometimes we get mixed up in mental illness as a factor in a crime and actually being unfit to stand trial because you fundamentally don't understand the consequences of your actions. You don't know that if you shoot someone, they might die. I feel like those lines are very blurred often in media reporting of mental illness and crimes.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, a part of me says, listen, if the way your mental illness is manifested is that you go on possibly racist or religiously tinged killing sprees, part of me says, I don't care. You're a terrorist, and let's deal with you like a terrorist. At the same time, what if this is a person who could take some type of medication and no longer feel or think any of this stuff?
So then what's to blame? A healthcare system that has left them behind? I don't know.
Oh, well, certainly there are plenty of crimes happening in this country and people who are desperate and destitute because of that. And I see that all the time. You see that all the time right outside the studio.
Well, that's a story for another day, actually. We were talking about this, Rachel, and when we talk about lone wolf and actually part of some kind of organized terrorist organization, mentally ill or not mentally ill, these are pretty amorphous designations, aren't they?
Definitely. I haven't really found a huge distinction between the kind of the lone wolf and perpetrator or mouthpiece of an organization in terms of the capacity of someone to commit a crime, because I feel as though if you have the appropriate plan in place and a weapon, those factors aren't going to matter quite as much. Yeah,
it's made a big deal. I mean, Jason, the backstory on this, to get you very quickly up to speed, is that very often we will hear, oh, this was ISIS inspired. And then it'll find out that there was no, it will be revealed that there was no actual connection or coordination with anyone that was part of ISIS. For me, that doesn't change that the ideology espoused by ISIS may still have been a factor. I am sort of less interested sometimes in whether someone that is, quote, part of ISIS directed an individual or whether their ideology inspired the individual. It's still an ideology that's problematic to me. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, it's very problematic, but, at the core of it, terrorism and this, extreme hate and violence is, something that, how is it, how are you not able to say that any organization that is, committing hate crimes, and inspiring this in other people isn't part of this, So, I mean, yeah.
That's an interesting point, which is even if there was no operational contact, is there not some responsibility because the ideology inspired them? That actually gets us, Louis, to the idea of stochastic terrorism we've talked about, which is if given a big enough audience, like, for example, Donald Trump and a big audience and suggesting that maybe guns could be used to deal with Hillary Clinton, you will never actually be liable for the fact that someone may have taken your statement as the inspiration for committing a crime. But statistically speaking, given a big enough group, you might actually be inspiring someone to take real-world action.
Hard to say how that influence is, how it's spread and how far it reaches. But I say, who cares? I mean, is it interesting to know if there's a coordination between ISIS and some guy here, Omar Mateen, let's say? Or ultimately, does it matter? It really doesn't. I mean, if it was a religiously motivated crime,
It is a hate crime, and we have a system that is set up to deal with that.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
But I also think that the way that you're going to deal with the crime is going to be different. If you're looking at a global jihad, you're probably going to put in place different measures than if you think, okay, this is an isolated person. How can we deal with this one act that they've committed?
Yeah, and it goes to the idea of, it actually goes back to the hate crime enhancement thing, which we were talking about earlier in the show, which we don't need to rehash, but I am sure I will get emails about as far as this story is concerned.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Peter Gray, who is a research professor of psychology at Boston College and also author of the book Free to Learn: Why Releasing the Instinct to Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. Peter, we've been talking a lot about the changing dynamics of the economy, job automation, proposals around basic income, etc. And one of the conversations that is sort of part of that is often less discussed is how would people be affected in a sort of sociocultural way if all of a sudden the need to work were eliminated? So let's start there. I've read some of what you've written about this. You think that there may be a pretty significant newfound sort of boredom and apathy that might infect society?
No, I think quite the opposite. I think there would be some people who might be bored and apathetic because play has been drilled out of them. People haven't have that instinct that we have to find interesting and fun things to do has been kind of drilled out of them by the work of school, by the work of their jobs and careers. But it's pretty natural to human beings to want to do interesting things and find great things to do. And if we had the time to do it, I think there would be a real flourishing of humanity, of human nature, a flourishing of culture.
I tend to agree with that. One of the things I've been thinking of is that really the last 150 or 200 years of sort of Western society have much more clearly delineated when are we working and when are we not working. And of course, the creation of the factory was a huge, huge factor in that. But if we think back to like hunter-gatherers, for example, the lines between what was working and what was play or recreational time were much more blurry, weren't they?
Well, that's exactly right. And in fact, I think it's reasonable to say, from an evolutionary perspective, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I look at sort of the long time frame of human existence. From an evolutionary perspective, work is kind of a new invention. During most of our human history, we were all hunter-gatherers. And it's really only with agriculture and then subsequently with industry that the idea of labor as work, as something that you don't want to do, but you have to do in order to get what you need to survive or get the things that you want, that notion of work is absent in hunter-gatherer bands. There have been studies of those groups of people in various parts of the world who survived as hunter-gatherers into modern times. And if they have a word for work at all, or a concept of it at all, it refers to what those farmers on the other side of the hill do, or those coal miners do. It doesn't refer to what they do. And there was even a book published 2 or 3 decades ago, maybe a little longer ago, by an anthropologist named Marshall Solon, in which he referred to hunter-gatherer society as the original affluent society. Affluent not because they had a lot, but because they didn't need much, and they had lots of free time, and they spent that free time at music and art and dance and storytelling and visiting neighbors and lying around in the hammock, gossiping, doing all the kinds of things that we do when we're on vacation, when we're freed up from work. It only takes them about 20 hours a week in the typical hunter-gatherer culture to provide for themselves, and even that they don't regard as work because it's thrilling, it's exciting to hunt and to gather, and they don't have to do it. You know, any individual doesn't have to do it, I would say, because they share everything, and they don't complain if somebody says, no, I'm not going to go out hunting today. I have friends to visit, or I have this or that to do. Very different attitude from ours.
Well, there's this sort of idea that I've heard a few people talk about, and it does make sense to me, which is that in sort of modern Western work, in the work paradigm that we have, the amount of work you have to do seems to be sort of pliable in that it will often adapt to the amount of time allocated for it. And I think it's very easy for a lot of people who work sort of like an office job to imagine how, if you know you're there for an 8 or 9 hour day, your entire work day will take 8 or 9 hours for you to complete your tasks. But if one day you know you're leaving early or you're coming in late and you have 5 hours, very often you're able to complete the work that you would normally do in 8 or 9 hours in the 5 or 6 that you allocate. Now, this analysis doesn't apply to shift work where you're actually there for a particular amount of time rather than for a particular number of tasks. But shouldn't that tell us something, at least, about the concept that we have about the work week and work schedules?
Yeah, I mean, you know, right now this is really an economics problem of how, you know, we're sort of stuck with a system that to support yourself, you've got to work a certain number of hours. There's not, you know, one of the problems we have, of course, is there's not really all that much work that needs to be done these days. You know, we've got machines. I mean, it takes very little human effort to grow all the food we need. It takes very little human effort to produce the clothing and shelter that we need, and so on and so forth. So we're in this ironic situation where it's easier than ever before to provide for our needs, and yet we're all working more perhaps than we ever did before, or more than we should need to be doing, way more than we should need to be doing. That's an economics problem. That's sort of out of my field. But if we could solve that economics problem, I think that we would all be much happier. We would have a better society. We would rediscover much of our humanity.
Well, let me follow up more along that line if I can, because there are some people who I talk to about topics that are either directly related to this or tangentially related will say, you know, the problem is that if we were to set up a system where there is a basic income, or that everybody's sort of basic needs are met and healthcare, basic food, shelter is provided for without necessarily having to work, humans are just inherently so lazy that most of them just wouldn't want to do anything. And from most of what I've read, that does not appear to be the case. What's your sense of that? This idea that humans didn't have to work in order to survive, that most of them would choose to do nothing or to be completely motionless. I tend to reject that completely.
Yeah, I mean, let me give 3 lines of evidence that lead me to reject it. One is, look at little kids, right? Look at little kids who are free. Those kids who are free to do what they want before they've ever started school, are they just lazy and lying around all day? No, they're into things. They're looking for things. They're making up stories. They're doing all kinds of things. There's no end to what they want to do. I don't think that capacity is unique to little kids. We drill it out of us when we send our kids to work-like schools, and then we go into this laborious kind of adult life. That's natural human behavior that we see in those little kids, and we would all retain that kind of behavior if in fact we didn't have it drilled out of us. Another line of evidence is the hunter-gatherer observations that I just described. And here's a third line of evidence. For people who don't know this book, I would recommend, this is a classic work by John Huizinga. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. There's a Dutch way of saying that name, called Homo Ludens. It's a classic work. Homo Ludens means man the player. And what Huizinga does in that book is he analyzes what we think of as high culture, the developments in philosophy and poetry, art, music, science, all the kinds of things that we value as sort of great human achievements. And he says, in what times and places have there been a flourishing of these things? And his conclusion is it's those times and places where there is a significant number of adults who have the leisure to play. and that all of this is coming out of play. All of these things that we think of as the highest sorts of contributions to our human heritage have come, places like Athens, ancient Athens. There were a group of free men, who had time to play throughout their lives, and look at what they did with that play. And housing identifies other points and places in history where the same thing has been true. So I think that we should all look very much forward to a time when we have the opportunity to play in adult life. According to Housing, we are man the player. That's our nature. That seems to be our nature when I look at hunter-gatherer cultures too. And we've been suppressing that nature for 2,000 or 3,000 years, if not longer, and ever since we've been so highly agriculturalized and then industrialized.
Well, I couldn't say it better myself, and I tend to be very skeptical of any argument that is an argument against an idea based on the assumption that humans are just going to be very, very lazy and free riders. I mean, you obviously have some element of that in any system, but I don't think it's by and large representative of human nature. We've been speaking with Professor Peter Gray, who teaches psychology at Boston College. You can also check out his book, Free to Learn. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
It's been delightful. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
For the second week in a row, the TSA has confiscated a record number of firearms at security checkpoints at a bunch of U.S. airports. 81 guns were seized between August 12th and 18th. And of the weapons, 70 were loaded. 31 actually were loaded with a chambered round, meaning that just squeezing the trigger would have discharged the firearm. This brings the number seized in 2016 from carry-on baggage to over 1,900. This is 400 more weapons seized than at this point last year. Usually, the way it works is there's a loaded gun in a carry-on bag or in a purse. TSA finds it, and the excuse is, I forgot. And Louis, we've told the story where you brought a knife on a plane. You also forgot. However, TSA did not notice that knife.
That is true. I legitimately forgot, and it was basically because it was this multi-tool that happened to have a big blade, and it wasn't just a combat knife. But that's the I forgot thing happens, and I'm sure many of these instances people actually did forget. Listen to all the stories we cover all the time that someone forgot they had their handgun in their purse or somewhere in the car, and then there's an quote accident. There's some negligent act.
Yeah, I mean, I would consider that if you are unaware of the location of your loaded firearm, right? That if you forget that a loaded firearm is in your purse, what you're basically saying is you've been entrusted with jurisdiction over this firearm, and you were unaware of the location of the loaded firearm. That to me is very, very concerning.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's also interesting because post 9/11, there was definitely heightened security in airports. And I remember when I was a lot younger, I tried to get through with a nail clipper and I couldn't. And
oh yeah, you could take down a plane with that.
Yeah, they actually confiscated it. And then on my most recent flight, I got in with a needle in my bag, yet they confiscated this much amount of water.
That sounds like an interesting story, actually. That we'll talk about that on the bonus show. So what is the process when TSA discovers that you have a firearm? Basically, that security checkpoint is completely shut down. Police are called. Everybody else gets angry who's around you, and you face a criminal referral and a fine of up to $11,000. I actually am really concerned about this. Number one, because I don't like the idea of people bringing guns into airports. But I'm more concerned because a recent test of the TSA where they went in and tried to sneak banned items through, 95% of them got through. So in my head, I'm thinking that there are 19 guns getting through security for every one that is being caught. Is that crazy to think might be going on?
Not at all. I mean, I remember, so my two stories are when I was a kid, I went to Texas. I brought M80s on my carry-on baggage into the plane and brought them back to Massachusetts. And the other one was I flew once from Florida to Massachusetts, stopped off. And then I got my, kind of similar to Lewis, got my Leatherman tool onto the plane, kind of unbeknownst to me. But then I took a layover in San Francisco. But the non-TSA, there's different, force.
There's a few airports that don't use TSA, essentially.
Exactly. But they caught me. And then I had to, get it off to somebody and, get on my plane flight. So.
And of course you could say, really? Well, TSA let me on the plane with this knife. They're not particularly successful. There are two reasons someone would be bringing unless you're truly ignorant of the fact that you're not allowed to have guns on planes, which is very hard for me to believe. You either are trying to bring the gun on the plane to use it on the plane, or to deliberately break a law, in which case you shouldn't be on the plane. Or, as I've said, you've lost track of where your firearm is, Lewis, and both, to me, would be reasons to keep somebody off of a plane.
Yes, but I don't think we know anybody who is the type of person. We know people who own plenty of guns, but they're not the people who leave guns everywhere. You walk into someone's house and there's a gun on every stand. There's a gun in the nightstand. There's a gun under the couch.
Yeah.
These people exist. They're everywhere in the United States. And I'm guessing a great deal of the people that got caught here is exactly that type of person.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in New York City. There's this thing called stop and frisk in New York City. It's controversial because it's disproportionately applied to Black and Latino people. And this is where police can decide to basically stop people, frisk them, and they're looking for guns or drugs. And there's been a pretty significant change made to the NYPD's attitude towards stop and frisk. Starting just under a month from now, NYPD officers are going to be issuing receipts to anyone that they stop but don't arrest, and they will be offering a reason why they did this. Officers will also have to fill in their badge number and provide contact information for the Civilian Review Board. This is coming out of a lawsuit called Floyd versus the City of New York, where a judge found that, yes, NYPD is unfairly targeting minorities for stop and frisk. There are some reform advocates who say the writing of the badge number is a concern because officers can just sort of scribble it and you'll never really know who it was. So there were actually some groups, Lewis, who wanted a card, sort of like a business card, to be given out, which would make it so that bad handwriting wouldn't prevent you from knowing who exactly frisked you.
Yeah, you don't need to do that. Make sure it's legible. And you have a cell phone. Tell them, I'm going to take a picture of your badge. I'm going to take a picture of your face. And, it's New York, so the police officers might beat you up for that, but it's still worth a shot. And I'm just picturing it now. They tell you, we stopped you and frisked you today because you're Black.
Well, that is not one of the boxes you can check on the receipt, Rachel. The officers will have categories, and they can say that they were acting as a lookout, that they believe that the individual they stopped and frisked may have been acting as a lookout, that they may have been engaging in a drug transaction, that they matched a specific suspect description that they were looking for.
Oh, boy.
These are very, very vague, and you can basically... This, I don't think, will change how easily it is to stop and frisk someone, but ideally, if their handwriting is good enough, will allow us to identify trends of particular officers who may be problematic.
Well, there's always going to be a way to kind of circumvent the truth. If you're looking at the body cams and all of the officers who are saying, oh, it got dislodged and it didn't record everything. I'm so sorry. It's not going to happen again. So how is this going to be different?
I think the difference would be that it at least makes it possible to have accountability. Obviously, if you switch off the body camera, the accountability goes away. If you scribble the badge number in a way that's not legible, or if you just check off, you thought maybe somebody was acting as a lookout. I get, Jason, how you can always take advantage of the system, but I still believe it's better to have something than nothing.
Yeah, I agree. So something else that I think is kind of relevant here is I heard a story about how there's this, it's similar to WhatsApp, and there's an app where kind of neighbors are kind of, alerting each other to activity. And they actually it's the first social media that's instituted a filter on their social media. So if you report a crime in your neighborhood, you can't just say, oh, there's a Black guy out there. You actually have to fill in, what do his shoes look like? What was he wearing, to kind of, slightly circumvent the racism and kind of, bigotry surrounding it.
This is something we should do a bigger story on, but I recently actually was there when someone called the police and there was a question asked about the race. Anyway, it's an interesting story, not a story for today, but let's agree to talk about it soon, and I want to get everybody's thoughts on it. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Funny voicemail today about Jason. Let's take a listen.
I bet you the new guy is not accused of being your lover as much, neither. So give you a break from those homophobes. And just remember, they all have crushes on you. That's why they hate on you so much. So don't trip. Take it as a compliment.
Yeah. So far, there has not, I think maybe Rachel had a little bit of a hard time hearing that. The point being made is we are not yet seeing the rush to suggest Jason is my boyfriend in the way that often we saw with Lewis. And I don't know if that's a good thing, a bad thing. I don't know that I would make a value statement of it, but it is interesting if nothing else.
I'll take it as a compliment. My manliness is just, exuding.
Yeah.
You exude hetero.
I actually, well, yeah, except for the fact that the first comment about Jason, Rachel, was that his name is gay. And I really, of course we talked about how ridiculous it is to even say that a name is gay, but just fixation. I don't get it.
Right. I also think that should be a compliment. The other way, opposite.
Either way, it's both a compliment and somebody who is very bizarrely fixated on sexual orientation.
Well,
No.
my advice to Jason is just wait. It's going to happen very quickly.
No, it would be a compliment of the opposite. He should be sad that they aren't saying that he's your boyfriend.
Right.
That's an honor.
What if the implication is they don't think Jason is
good enough
good
for you.
enough to be my boyfriend?
I think that's what it is. It's a big title to fill.
Well, my head was held high and now it's down low.
Yeah. Anyway, plenty more time, I am sure, for that type of speculation. On the bonus show today, we will hear from Rachel whether or not she ate shark and whale during her recent trip to Iceland. We will talk about drone delivery, and we will also talk about, what else? A story involving hot water, boiling water being thrown onto a gay couple's face by a homophobe. A truly horrific story. Those stories and more on the bonus show. Sign up at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.